Tonight, we examine a case that once commanded national attention and then passed quietly into the historical record. A single investigation, a verdict never returned against anyone, and a question that has remained unanswered for more than a century. The case of Matilda Hacker begins in Canterbury, Kent, in the early years of the 19th century. Canterbury at that time was a cathedral city of moderate size. Its economy, built around the cathedral precincts, the surrounding market trade, and a network of substantial townhouses occupied by professional and propertied families. The city's identity was inseparable from its ecclesiastical history, and its streets retained a medieval layout of narrow lanes converging on the cathedral close, with newer residential terraces extending outward toward Wincheap and the surrounding parishes. Property ownership in Canterbury during this period was concentrated among a comparatively small number of families, many of whom derived income not from a single profession, but from rents collected on multiple houses let to tenants. It was into this environment that Matilda Hacker was born, the exact year of her birth uncertain, with surviving accounts placing it variously between 1811 and 1813. Her father, John Hacker, is recorded in some sources as a stone engraver by trade, a craft closely tied to the cathedral city's ecclesiastical and commemorative work. Over the course of his life, John Hacker is understood to have become a man of some means, acquiring 4 houses in the Blackfriars area of Canterbury and building a degree of prosperity through the rental income those properties generated. One account associates him with the funding of a clock added to the tower of St George's Church in Canterbury in 1837, though this detail rests on a single source and is treated here as probable rather than firmly established. Of Matilda's mother, almost nothing reliable survives in the record. A name is given in one weaker source, but it is not corroborated elsewhere, and is not treated as established fact in this account. What is more securely documented is the presence of one sister, Amelia Hacker, who, like Matilda, never married, and who remained closely associated with her throughout both of their lives. The 2 sisters were known locally and remembered for decades afterward by a pair of informal nicknames, the Canterbury Belles and, alternatively, the Wincheap Dolls of Canterbury. The names arose from a habit the sisters maintained well into their 50s, that of dressing identically in matching silk dresses, lace shawls, and feathered hats, an eccentricity that set them apart in a city where such uniformity of dress among grown women was unusual and drew comment. Neighbours and townspeople came to regard the Hacker sisters as local curiosities, figures whose appearance on the streets of Canterbury was distinctive enough to be remembered and repeated in later accounts of the city. This same tendency toward eccentric self-presentation persisted in Matilda into old age, where it took the form of dressing markedly younger than her years, wearing ringlets and bright sashes more commonly associated with a much younger woman, and consulting what was described as a dream book on a daily basis. No school record for either sister survives, and nothing in the available documentation indicates the nature or extent of their formal education. What the record does establish, repeatedly and consistently, is a reputation in Canterbury for secrecy regarding personal finances, and a documented history of disputes over local rates on inherited property. Amelia Hacker died in 1873. Her death marks a clear point of division in the surviving account of Matilda Hacker's life, for it was at this juncture that the rental income from the family's Canterbury properties passed to Matilda for the remainder of her lifetime. The years that followed saw a marked change in her circumstances and her conduct. Where the 2 sisters together had maintained a fixed, if eccentric, presence in Canterbury, Matilda alone now possessed an independent income sufficient to live without settled employment, and it was in the years after 1873 that she began the pattern of movement and concealment that would come to define the final period of her life. She left Canterbury, first for Brighton and later for London, and in doing so began to construct an existence in which she was, by design, difficult for anyone, including her own relatives, to locate. The origin of this pattern lay in a specific and long-running dispute. Matilda Hacker owned valuable property inherited through her family in Canterbury, yet she refused, as a matter of principle, to pay the local rates assessed against it. This was not a passing disagreement. She had already served a period of confinement in Westgate Jail in Canterbury over unpaid rates, and jewellery belonging to her had at one point been seized against outstanding debts. Rather than resolve the matter through payment, Matilda chose instead to remove herself from the reach of the rate collectors altogether, adopting a life of near constant relocation between lodging houses, frequently under invented names rather than her own. This choice, made deliberately and sustained over several years, is the reason her whereabouts were unknown even to her own family by the time she disappeared from view entirely. Concealment was not incidental to her final years. It was the structure around which her final years were built. Now, back to the record. By October of 1877, Matilda Hacker had taken lodgings on the second floor of a house at number 4, Euston Square, in the Bloomsbury district of London. She was known there not by her own name but under an alias, recorded in surviving documents as either Miss Hewish or Miss Hewish, the spelling inconsistent across the sources that preserve it. The house at 4 Euston Square was run as a lodging establishment by Severin and Mary Bastendorff, a married couple who occupied the property with their children and who let rooms to a small number of tenants of independent means. The household also included a domestic servant, a young woman named Hannah Dobbs, employed as the family's maid. Matilda Hacker, in keeping with the pattern she had established over the preceding years, kept largely to herself within this arrangement, occupying her rented room while the remainder of the household continued its own domestic routine around her. The clearest reconstruction of the final days of her tenancy at Euston Square does not come from a court record or a police report, but from a later secondary account, and it should be understood accordingly as the best available working outline of events rather than a verified sequence established at trial. According to this reconstruction, a critical and unexplained event is believed to have occurred on or around the 14th of October, 1878. Hannah Dobbs is recorded as having collected rent from Matilda Hacker on the 15th of October. 2 days later, on the 17th of October, Dobbs informed the household that Hacker had moved out of her room. Investigators would later conclude that this account given by Dobbs was false, and that Matilda Hacker had in fact been killed and her body concealed within the house at around this time. No member of the household and no relative of Matilda Hacker's raised an alarm in the weeks or months that followed. Given the life she had constructed for herself, one in which she was already accustomed to vanishing from the awareness of rate collectors, former neighbours, and her own family, her absence from Euston Square did not, at the time, appear to anyone as a departure requiring explanation. The house at 4 Euston Square continued to function as an ordinary lodging establishment throughout the winter of 1878 and into the following year. The Bastendorff family remained in residence. Hannah Dobbs continued in her position as domestic servant. Other lodgers came and went in the ordinary course of the house's business, unaware of what the coal cellar beneath them was later found to contain. This state of affairs persisted for approximately 7 months, during which the household above continued its daily routine without apparent disruption or suspicion, an arrangement that would only be broken by a task connected to the household's fuel supply, and which is documented in the section of this account concerned with the discovery of the body. The task that finally broke this arrangement was an ordinary one, repeated in households across London wherever a coal cellar served a family's fuel needs. On the 9th of May 1879, an errand boy of about 15 years of age, named in one surviving account as William Stroman, was sent down into the cellar beneath 4 Euston Square to clear away a quantity of coal. The cellar was accessed, as was standard in houses of this design, by a coal hole set into the pavement above, through which deliveries were tipped down a chute into the space below, to be shoveled and stacked by hand as needed. It was a task performed without ceremony, in near darkness, by boys whose work carried them into corners of a house that its residents upstairs rarely saw or thought about. In the course of clearing the coal that morning, the boy uncovered something beneath the surface that was not coal at all. What he found, partly buried in coal dust and in an advanced state of decomposition, was the body of a woman. The state of the remains was such that identification could not proceed by way of the face, or by any feature that might have been recognised by sight. It was instead the dress worn by the deceased, and certain other physical particulars that had survived the months of concealment, which first suggested to those called to the scene that this had once been a person of some means, dressed in a manner consistent with an older woman of independent income, rather than a servant or a labourer. Word of the discovery spread quickly through the household, and then beyond it, and within a short time the police had been summoned to 4 Euston Square to begin what would become one of the most closely followed investigations London had seen in some years. The scene that greeted the officers who descended into that cellar was one of considerable difficulty. The remains had lain undisturbed for a period that would later be estimated only in the broadest terms, and the coal dust and confined, poorly ventilated space in which they had rested for months had not been kind to the work of identification. A cord or rope was noted as being coiled about the neck of the deceased, a detail that would carry weight in the findings that followed, though the physical evidence available did not, in itself, resolve every question that the discovery raised. The officers present that day proceeded methodically, as was required in a case of this gravity, securing the cellar, arranging for the removal of the remains, and beginning the process of establishing who this woman had been, and how she had come to be concealed beneath a house that had continued, all the while, to function as a home for a family, and its lodgers above. News of the discovery at Euston Square did not remain confined to the immediate neighbourhood for long. Within days, London newspapers had begun to report on the case, under the name that would attach itself permanently to the affair, the Euston Square Mystery, and the story spread rapidly through the capital and beyond it, carried by an appetite among readers for accounts of crime uncovered in respectable, ordinary households, rather than in the districts more commonly associated with violence. Bloomsbury itself at that time was not a district given to notoriety. Euston Square sat among rows of terraced lodging houses built for a solidly middle class of tenants, professionals, clerks, and women of independent means among them, its garden square and railings presenting an appearance of order and respectability entirely at odds with what had just been found beneath one of its houses. It was precisely this contrast, a body concealed for months beneath the everyday business of a functioning household, that fixed the case in the public imagination from its earliest days and ensured that the investigation which followed would be conducted under a degree of scrutiny few cases of the period attracted. The investigation that followed the discovery at 4 Euston Square was formally opened within hours, under the direction of officers of the Criminal Investigation Department. One account names Inspector Charles Hargan as the officer who led the inquiry, though this detail rests on a single source, and is treated here with appropriate caution rather than as fully corroborated fact. Whoever directed its earliest stages, the investigation proceeded along 2 parallel lines from the outset. The first concerned with establishing the identity of the woman found in the cellar, and the second with reconstructing the circumstances by which she'd come to be there. Identification proved the more immediate obstacle. The condition of the remains ruled out recognition by sight, and for a period the woman found beneath 4 Euston Square remained, to the officers investigating her death, entirely without a name. The breakthrough came not through any witness or document, but through dental evidence. A local dentist, on hearing of the case as it was reported in the press, recalled having fitted a denture cast some time earlier for a woman who had never returned to collect the finished work. The particulars of that unclaimed denture were compared against the remains recovered from the cellar and found to correspond with the missing teeth of the deceased. Through this match, the body was identified as that of Matilda Hacker, a woman who had been lodging in the house under an assumed name and who had not, until that moment, been reported missing by anyone connected to her. With a name established, investigators turned to the question of who among the household at 4 Euston Square might account for her disappearance the previous October. Attention settled quickly on Hannah Dobbs, the domestic servant employed by the Bastendorff family. It emerged in the course of inquiries that Dobbs had, in the months following Matilda Hacker's disappearance, come into possession of a watch, items of jewellery and other property that had belonged to the missing lodger, and that she had subsequently pawned several of these items at establishments in the vicinity. Investigators traced the pawned property back to Dobbs through the records kept by the pawnbrokers. Records that were, by law and by custom, meticulous as to the description of goods and the identity of the person presenting them. Dobbs was further established as the last person within the household known to have had direct contact with Matilda Hacker, in her capacity as the servant who had collected rent from the lodger in the days before her disappearance was first reported. It had been Dobbs, moreover, who informed the rest of the household in October of 1878 that Hacker had moved out, an account investigators now regarded as false in light of what had been found in the cellar. The combination of these circumstances, the possession and disposal of the dead woman's property, the position as last known contact, and the false explanation offered for her absence, was sufficient to bring Hannah Dobbs under formal suspicion. A further discovery lent physical weight to the case being assembled against her. A bloodstain was found on the carpet of the room that had been occupied by Matilda Hacker during her tenancy at Euston Square, a stain subsequently confirmed through examination to be blood. Mary Bastendorff, the wife of the household's proprietor, recalled that a lamp had at some point been broken in that room, and that a stain had been noticed on the carpet at the time, an occurrence that had then been dismissed within the household as an ordinary domestic accident rather than anything requiring further attention. In light of the body's discovery, this earlier and previously unremarkable incident was reconsidered by investigators as a possible trace of the violence that had been done to the missing lodger. Statements were taken from members of the household and from those in the surrounding neighbourhood who might have observed anything unusual in the autumn of the previous year. The Bastendorff family itself, Severin, Mary and their children, were questioned as to the ordinary business of the house during the period in question, and as to their knowledge of the lodger who had occupied the upstairs room under a name that was not her own. Neighbours were asked whether they had observed any disturbance, any unfamiliar visitor, or any alteration in the household's routine during the weeks in which Matilda Hacker was later determined to have met her death. The picture that emerged from these enquiries was one of a household that had, on its surface, continued about its business without apparent interruption, its residents either unaware of what had occurred beneath them or unwilling, for reasons the investigation sought to establish, to disclose it. As the inquiry progressed, officers also worked to reconstruct what could be established of Matilda Hacker's own history, tracing her movements from Canterbury through Brighton and into London, and establishing, through correspondence with relatives and through records held in Canterbury itself, the pattern of concealment and relocation that had characterised the final years of her life. This work confirmed what the household at Euston Square had itself observed, that the woman known to them as Miss Ewish had been secretive about her own affairs, that she had kept to herself, and that no one in the house, least of all the servant charged with collecting her rent, appeared to have known her true name or the full extent of her means until after her death had already been established. By the conclusion of these inquiries, sufficient evidence had been assembled against Hannah Dobbs to bring the matter before the coroner and in due course before the criminal courts. The investigation had proceeded from an unidentified body in a coal cellar to a named victim, a household under scrutiny, and a single named suspect. Within a period of weeks following the discovery of the 9th of May, it had done so through the patient correlation of pawnbrokers' records, household testimony, and physical evidence recovered from the room in which Matilda Hacker had last been known to reside, rather than through any single decisive breakthrough, a pattern consistent with the procedural methods available to the Metropolitan Police at the close of the 1870s. Medical examination of the remains recovered from 4 Euston Square was conducted in the days following their removal from the cellar, and the findings reached were, in significant respects, limited by the condition in which the body had been found. The examining physician was able to confirm that death had resulted from violence rather than natural causes, and noted the cord found coiled about the neck of the deceased as consistent with strangulation. Beyond this, the examination could not proceed with the certainty a fresher body would have allowed. The advanced state of decomposition made it impossible for the physician to state with confidence whether the injuries to the neck represented strangulation carried out by another hand or whether some other explanation might account for the same physical signs. No name for the examining physician survives in the sources available for this account, a gap in the record that is noted here rather than filled with invention. Equally limited was the physician's ability to fix the date of death with any precision. The estimate offered placed death within a window of roughly 1 to 3 years prior to the body's discovery in May of 1879, a range too broad to confirm, on medical grounds alone, that Matilda Hacker had died in October of the previous year, as the investigation's reconstruction of events otherwise suggested. The October date remained, in this sense, a working conclusion drawn from the testimony of the household and the pattern of Hannah Dobbs's own account, rather than a fact established through medical examination. This distinction between what the physical evidence could confirm and what the surrounding circumstances suggested would remain a feature of the case through the whole of the proceedings that followed. The findings of the medical examination were carried forward to a coroner's inquest, convened in the weeks after the discovery to determine, under law, the cause and circumstances of Matilda Hacker's death. The exact date of the inquest and the name of the coroner who presided over it do not survive in the sources consulted for this account, though the outcome of the proceeding is well established. Witnesses from the household at Euston Square were called to give evidence, along with the physician who had examined the remains and the officers who had led the investigation in its early stages. The errand boy who had made the discovery in the cellar was among those whose account was placed before the coroner and the jury sworn to hear the matter. At the conclusion of the evidence presented, the coroner's jury returned a verdict of willful murder, finding that Matilda Hacker had been killed by some person or persons unknown. This verdict, framed in the formal language customary to inquests of the period, left open the question of who among those connected to the household bore responsibility, while establishing as a matter of legal record that the death was not accidental and not self-inflicted, notwithstanding the medical uncertainty that had earlier attended the examination of the body. The verdict cleared the way for the case to proceed as a criminal matter, and it was on the strength of the evidence gathered against her, the pawned property, her position as last known contact, and the bloodstain recovered from the room she had occupied, that Hannah Dobbs was subsequently committed to stand trial at the Old Bailey. The period between the inquest's verdict and the opening of the trial was one of considerable public interest, the case having by this point been followed in newspapers across the country under the name first given to it in the days after the discovery. Hannah Dobbs, 24 years of age at the time, was held on the charge of willful murder, a charge that carried, if proven, the sentence of death by hanging, a fact that would weigh on the proceedings that followed and on the jury that would ultimately be asked to decide her fate. Her position within the household, as a servant of limited means facing the full weight of a capital charge, stood in evident contrast to the picture the prosecution would attempt to establish of a woman capable of concealing a killing beneath the house in which she worked for the better part of a year. The trial of Hannah Dobbs opened at the Old Bailey on the 30th of June, 1879, before Mr. Justice Hawkins, with contemporary press accounts placing her formal arraignment on Wednesday, the 2nd of July. The names of the counsel who appeared for the prosecution and for the defence do not survive in the sources consulted for this account and are not stated here. The courtroom was reported to have been crowded throughout the proceedings, a reflection of the degree to which the Euston Square Mystery had captured public attention in the week since the discovery of the body, and the case was followed closely by newspapers that reported its progress in daily instalments to readers across the country. The charge before the court was wilful murder, and the prosecution set out to establish, through the evidence gathered in the course of the investigation, that Hannah Dobbs had killed Matilda Hacker at 4 Euston Square in the autumn of the previous year, and had thereafter concealed the body in the coal cellar beneath the house. Central to the case presented was the property recovered from the pawnbrokers, the watch and items of jewellery that had belonged to the dead woman, and that Dobbs was shown to have pawned under her own name in the months following Hacker's disappearance. The prosecution contended that this possession and disposal of the missing lodger's property was consistent with guilt and difficult to reconcile with any innocent explanation, and pawnbrokers were called to give evidence identifying Dobbs as the person who had brought the items to them. The bloodstain recovered from the carpet of Matilda Hacker's former room was presented to the jury as physical evidence connecting the room, and by extension, its occupant, to an act of violence, notwithstanding that the stain itself could not establish who had been responsible for it. Mary Bastendorff's recollection of the broken lamp and the mark it had left was placed before the court as part of the same body of evidence, an incident that had seemed unremarkable at the time and had only acquired significance in light of what was later found beneath the house. The prosecution also drew attention to Dobbs's position within the household as the person who had last collected rent from Hacker and who had subsequently told the family that the lodger had moved out, an account the Crown maintained was untrue and had been offered to conceal what had actually occurred. Under cross-examination, it emerged that Hannah Dobbs had prior convictions for theft, a detail the defence was obliged to confront and one that complicated the picture of her character placed before the jury. It was suggested in the course of the trial, though not established as proven facts within the proceedings themselves, that Dobbs's position in the household had been secured, in part through a personal relationship with Savourin Bastendorff, the owner of the house. This was raised as a matter touching upon her circumstances and opportunity rather than as evidence directly bearing upon the charge of murder, and the trial did not resolve the full nature or extent of that relationship, a matter that would only become public in fuller and more contested form in the months that followed the verdict. The defence contended that the evidence assembled against Dobbs, while sufficient to raise suspicion, fell short of the certainty required to convict on a capital charge. The medical evidence, which could not establish with confidence that the death was the result of strangulation by another hand rather than some other cause, was cited as a further ground for doubt, along with the absence of any witness able to place Dobbs at the scene of a killing or to describe the act itself. The jury was reminded, as was customary in capital cases of the period, that a conviction would carry the sentence of death, a consideration that bore directly on the weight jurors were prepared to place on evidence that remained, in critical respects, circumstantial rather than direct. The jury retired to consider its verdict after the close of evidence and the summing up of the case by the presiding judge. Contemporary accounts offered afterward as press interpretation rather than as any documented statement of the jury's own reasoning suggested that jurors found it difficult to accept that a young woman of slight build could have carried out and single-handedly concealed a killing of this nature, and that they were mindful throughout of the finality of the sentence a guilty verdict would bring. Whatever combination of reasoning informed their decision, the jury returned a verdict of not guilty, and Hannah Dobbs was acquitted of the charge of willful murder on the 2nd of July 1879. No other person was charged with the killing of Matilda Hacker at any point thereafter, and the case, insofar as the criminal law was concerned, closed without a conviction against anyone. Hannah Dobbs walked free from the Old Bailey on the 2nd of July 1879, the acquittal bringing to a close the only criminal trial the killing of Matilda Hacker would ever produce. No sentence followed, and no further charge was brought against her or against any other individual in connection with the death. For the household at 4 Euston Square, and for the wider public that had followed the case through its weeks of newspaper coverage, the acquittal left the central question of the Euston Square Mystery formally unresolved. A woman dead by violence in a house whose occupants had continued to live above her concealed body for the better part of a year, with no person held legally responsible for what had occurred. The matter did not end with the verdict. In the months following her acquittal, Hannah Dobbs entered into an arrangement with a publisher named George Purkis, proprietor of the Illustrated Police News, and sold to him a written statement setting out her own account of events at Euston Square. This account, published under the title The Euston Square Mystery, extraordinary statement made by Hannah Dobbs, went considerably further than anything established at trial. In it, Dobbs accused Severin Bastendorff directly of the murder of Matilda Hacker, and she admitted, for the first time publicly, to having conducted an affair with him during her employment in his household. She further claimed that Bastendorff had pressured her to attribute a resulting pregnancy to one of his brothers, and made additional allegations against members of the Bastendorff family that were never tested before any court and remain, in the absence of such testing, uncorroborated claims rather than established fact. Severin Bastendorff responded to the publication of Dobbs's statement by bringing a libel action against Purkis, a suit that brought the matter back before the courts in a civil rather than a criminal proceeding. In the course of that trial, evidence was presented establishing that Bastendorff and Dobbs had indeed conducted an affair, including testimony that the two had at one point stayed together at an inn in Redhill, Surrey, posing as husband and wife. This evidence directly contradicted the sworn denial Bastendorff had given at Dobbs' original murder trial, when he had testified under oath that no such relationship existed between them. The libel action concluded in Purkis's favour, the claims in Dobbs' statement regarding the affair having been substantiated, and Bastendorff's earlier testimony having been shown to be false. The consequence for Severin Bastendorff was a prosecution not for murder, a charge that was never brought against him, but for perjury, arising from the false evidence he had given under oath at the original trial concerning his relationship with Hannah Dobbs. He was convicted on this charge and sentenced to 12 months' imprisonment with hard labour, a sentence he served as punishment for lying to the court rather than for any involvement in the death of Matilda Hacker. This distinction between the perjury for which Bastendorff was convicted and the murder for which no one was ever convicted remained a fixed feature of how the case was subsequently understood, the two matters connected in the public mind by their shared origin in the same household but entirely separate as a matter of law. Beyond this sequence of publication, libel action, and perjury conviction, the historical record falls silent on the later lives of the two figures most closely associated with the case. No account has been found of what became of Hannah Dobbs after the publication of her statement and the conclusion of the libel proceedings that followed it, and she does not reappear in any source consulted for this account. Severin Bastendorff's life, after the completion of his 12-month sentence, is similarly undocumented in the material available. Both figures, having occupied the centre of one of the most closely followed criminal cases of the decade, pass out of the historical record entirely once the immediate legal consequences of the affair had run their course. The case did not disappear from public memory once the criminal and civil proceedings connected to it had concluded. It survived instead in the newspaper record of 1879, preserved in the daily and weekly press accounts that had followed the investigation, the trial, and the subsequent libel action under the name first given to it in the days after the discovery. Hannah Dobbs's own published statement, issued through George Perkes in the aftermath of her acquittal, remained itself a part of the case's afterlife, a period document that carried her account of events, disputed and uncorroborated in its more serious allegations, into wider circulation than the trial record alone would have reached. In the century and a half since, the case has been the subject of dedicated book-length treatment by more than one author. Sinclair Mackay's account, published under the title Murder at No. 4 Euston Square, The Mystery of the Lady in the Cellar, examines the case in detail, drawing on the surviving trial record and contemporary press coverage to reconstruct the events at the house in Bloomsbury. A further dedicated study, Matilda Hacker at Euston Square, Evidence, Doubt, and the Unsolved Victorian Murder of Miss Hacker by Adrian Holden, has likewise treated the case as a subject in its own right, examining the evidence gathered in 1879 and the questions that evidence left unanswered. Beyond these principal works, the case has continued to be referenced in broader surveys of Victorian crime. Its combination of a concealed body, a contested trial, and an acquittal that satisfied no one, having secured it a lasting place among the unsolved cases of the period. The house at 4 Euston Square itself, and the square in which it stood, became for a time synonymous with the case in the public mind, its ordinary, respectable appearance standing in continued contrast to what had been found within it. That association between a specific, nameable address and a killing that was never resolved is a large part of what has kept the case in circulation, long after the newspapers that first reported it had ceased publication, and the courtroom in which Hannah Dobbs stood trial had moved on to other business entirely. The case of Matilda Hacker sits within a broader pattern of life available to unmarried women of independent means in late Victorian Britain, a pattern shaped as much by the legal and financial structures of the period as by individual circumstance. Property law at the time was built around assumptions of male or married ownership, and a woman such as Hacker, unmarried and in possession of inherited rental income, occupied a position that afforded her a measure of independence while leaving her exposed to obligations such as local rates that she could contest but not escape through any formal legal channel. Her response, sustained relocation under invented names, was an unusual solution to an ordinary bureaucratic grievance, but it depended on a feature of London lodging house life that was itself entirely common in the period: the ease with which a woman of some means could take a room, pay her rent, and be accepted into a household on terms that required no verification of who she claimed to be. The lodging house culture of Bloomsbury and similar districts of inner London in the 1870s rested on precisely this informality. Houses, such as the one at 4 Euston Square, were let, room by room, to tenants whose only qualification was the ability to pay, and landlords, such as the Bastendorffs, derived their livelihood from filling those rooms rather than from investigating the histories of those who occupied them. It was this arrangement that allowed Matilda Hacker to live for more than a year within a single household, under a name that was not her own, known to those around her only as a quiet, older lodger with old-fashioned habits and a preference for keeping to herself. The same arrangement, once her death was discovered, made the household itself, its family, its servant, and its ordinary daily business, the entire and only field within which investigators could search for an explanation. No legal or procedural reform is documented as having followed directly from the case, and it produced no change in the law governing lodging houses, servants, or the investigation of concealed deaths. What it left behind instead was a record unusually well preserved for a case of its type. The trial itself documented in the surviving files of the Old Bailey, and the surrounding events chronicled at length in the contemporary press, even as certain foundational details, the date of Matilda Hacker's birth, the name of the physician who examined her remains, the precise circumstances of her death, were never established with certainty and remain gaps in the record to this day. The pawnbroking system through which Hannah Dobbs's possession of Matilda Hacker's property was traced operated under a strict framework of record-keeping that had been established by statute earlier in the century and remained substantially unchanged through the 1870s. Every article pledged at a licensed pawnbroker's shop was entered into a ledger maintained on the premises, recording a description of the item, the sum advanced against it, and the name and address given by the person presenting it. A duplicate ticket was issued to the pledger, and the original entry remained in the shop's books, available for inspection by the police in the course of any inquiry. This system, designed principally to allow the recovery of stolen goods and the tracing of persons suspected of theft, provided investigators in the Hacker case with a documentary trail that did not depend on memory or testimony alone. Officers making enquiries at pawn shops in the vicinity of Euston Square would have worked from a description of the missing woman's effects, cross-referencing entries against the descriptions supplied by relatives or by the household, a slow and methodical process conducted shop by shop across a district containing a considerable number of such establishments. The reliability of this method rested on the requirement that a name be given at the counter, and it was a common feature of cases of this kind that persons pledging goods obtained by illicit means gave their correct name and address regardless, either through ignorance of the risk or through simple habit, since a false name offered no protection once a ticket had been issued and a pattern of pledging established. Once Dobbs's name had been connected to one pledged item, the same ledgers could be searched for further entries under that name, allowing investigators to build, item by item, an inventory of what had passed from the dead woman's possession into pawn. Watches were among the most commonly pledged items of the period, valuable, compact, and readily identifiable by serial number or maker's mark. And it was through such particulars that a watch belonging to Matilda Hacker could be matched with confidence to an entry made months earlier in a pawnbroker's book. The coroner's inquest that returned its verdict in the case followed a form of procedure that had governed such inquiries in England for centuries, adapted only gradually to the circumstances of a modern city the size of London. A coroner's jury, typically composed of local men drawn from the district in which the death had occurred or the body had been found, was sworn to view the remains before hearing any evidence, a requirement that placed jurors in direct and often distressing contact with the physical reality of the case before a single witness had spoken. Only after this viewing had taken place would the coroner proceed to hear testimony, calling witnesses in an order of his own choosing and retaining wide latitude to question them directly, a role considerably more active than that typically exercised by a judge presiding over a criminal trial. The inquest was not bound by the same rules of evidence that would later govern proceedings at the Old Bailey, and hearsay, character evidence, and matters of local knowledge that a criminal court would have excluded were frequently admitted on the reasoning that the coroner's task was to establish, as best the available facts allowed, the cause and circumstances of death rather than to determine guilt beyond reasonable doubt. The verdict available to a coroner's jury was correspondingly broader than the binary choice between guilty and not guilty that a criminal trial required. A jury might find death by natural causes, death by misadventure, death by suicide, or, where the evidence supported it, willful murder against a named individual or against a person or persons unknown. This last formulation, employed in the Hacker inquest, carried a specific legal consequence, permitting the case to proceed toward prosecution once a suspect had been identified, without requiring the coroner's jury itself to name that suspect at the time its verdict was returned. The inquest into Matilda Hacker's death was thus able to establish, as a matter of formal record, that a murder had occurred weeks before the investigation had gathered sufficient evidence to bring any individual before the criminal courts. The house at 4 Euston Square, in its physical construction, was typical of the terraces built across Bloomsbury in the decades before Matilda Hacker took her room there. Such houses rose 4 or 5 stories above a semi-sunken basement level, the basement given over to the kitchen, the scullery, and storage, including coal storage, with the servants' quarters typically located either in the basement itself or in the attic rooms at the top of the house. The 2 levels furthest removed from the more presentable rooms, let to lodgers or occupied by the family in between. The coal cellar beneath such a house was frequently built forward under the pavement itself, extending the usable space of the basement out beneath the street. And it was this arrangement, common to the entire terrace and not unique to the Bastendorff household, that placed a street-level coal hole directly above the space in which Matilda Hacker's body had been concealed. Coal deliveries to such houses were a routine and frequent event. Sacks tipped down the chute at intervals through the autumn and winter months to supply the kitchen range and household fires, each delivery adding a fresh layer over whatever already lay beneath, a detail that goes some way toward explaining how a concealment begun in October of 1878 could remain undisturbed through an entire winter of a working household's ordinary fuel consumption. The newspapers that carried the case to a national audience did so through a system of coverage that combined local reporting from the Middlesex courts with syndication to provincial papers across England, a practice well established by 1879 and one that allowed a case originating in a single London square to be read within days by audiences in cities and towns, with no direct connection to Bloomsbury at all. The Illustrated Police News, the publication that would later carry Hannah Dobbs's own statement into print, specialised in precisely this kind of case, combining written accounts of crime and its investigation with illustrated plates depicting scenes from the events described, a format that had built for the paper a substantial readership among those drawn to accounts of criminal proceedings rendered in vivid and accessible form. Daily papers covering the trial itself reported the proceedings at length, reproducing testimony given in court in something close to verbatim form for readers unable to attend the Old Bailey in person, a practice that ensured the arguments made by prosecution and defence alike, and the medical uncertainty at the heart of the case remained matters of public record and public discussion throughout the summer of 1879. The crowds that gathered outside the Old Bailey through the days of the trial were reported by more than one paper to have exceeded the capacity of the public gallery many times over, so that admission to the courtroom itself became, for ordinary members of the public, a matter of arriving hours before proceedings opened and waiting in a queue that stretched along the street outside. Tickets of admission to the more prominent trials of the period were issued in limited number, and those without one were left to gather what information they could from newspaper boys selling special editions printed and distributed within hours of each day's session closing. The presses of Fleet Street working to have an account of the morning's testimony on the streets before the afternoon session had concluded. Artists employed by the illustrated papers worked from within the courtroom itself, sketching the principal figures, the judge upon the bench, counsel at their tables, and Hannah Dobbs in the dock. Likenesses that were then engraved and reproduced as plates accompanying the written accounts carried in papers such as the Illustrated Police News in the days following. Correspondence columns in several of the papers that covered the case carried letters from readers offering their own theories as to what had occurred at Euston Square, a number of them addressed directly to the question the medical evidence had left unresolved, whether the marks upon the body were consistent with strangulation at another's hand or with some other cause the physician had been unable to exclude. Such letters were characteristic of the period's newspaper culture, in which cases of sufficient public interest generated a form of running public discussion conducted in print. Readers weighing evidence reported from the courtroom against their own understanding of the household servant, and the lodger who had died among them under a name not her own. Provincial papers, receiving the case through the syndicated wire reports that connected London's daily press to newspapers across England, Scotland, and Wales, reprinted these accounts with local framing of their own, several noting for their readers that a case of this character, a concealed body, an accused servant, an acquittal that left the true circumstances unresolved, was without close precedent in their own recent memory. Within the household itself, and among those in Bloomsbury who had known the Bastendorff family or had passed the house at 4 Euston Square, in the ordinary course of their own business in the neighbourhood, the trial's proceedings were followed with an attention sharpened by proximity rather than mere curiosity. Tradesmen who had supplied the household, other lodging-house keepers on the same square, and residents of neighbouring streets found themselves, for the length of the trial, at the centre of a case that had made their ordinary corner of London a subject of conversation, as far away as papers printed in Glasgow and in Dublin carried summaries of the evidence given each day. The square itself, its garden and railings, unchanged in their outward appearance throughout the whole of the proceedings, continued to be pointed out by those who passed it as the place where the events reported daily in the papers had occurred, a house among houses that had, in the space of a few weeks, become known well beyond the limits of the district in which it stood. No arrest was ever made, the investigation was formally closed, the case remains open, the record remains incomplete. That is where the record of the first case closes. We turn now to a second account, drawn from a different county and a different decade, concerning a woman of independent means, whose disappearance was, for a long time, explained away rather than investigated, and whose case would not be resolved for the better part of 4 years. It begins not in a city but in a remote corner of rural England, in a house set apart by water on 3 sides. The case of Camille Cecile Holland begins in the county of Essex in the closing years of the 19th century. The precise circumstances of her birth are not established with certainty in the surviving record, and the account that follows treats her origins with appropriate caution rather than asserting a version that cannot be confirmed. What is established is that by 1899, at the age of 56, she was a woman of independent financial means, unmarried and accustomed to managing her own affairs. Essex, in the final decade of the 19th century, remained outside its market towns, a predominantly agricultural county. The district of Clavering, in the northwest of the county, near the Hertfordshire and Cambridgeshire borders, was flat, quiet farmland, dotted with scattered farmsteads, and connected by narrow lanes to the nearby market towns of Saffron Walden and Stansted. The rhythms of life in this part of Essex were governed by the agricultural calendar, and the population was sparse enough that a household could exist for years, with little outside scrutiny of its internal arrangements. Moated farmhouses, a legacy of medieval construction, were not uncommon in this part of the county, built with defensive water margins that by the 19th century served chiefly as boundaries for livestock and as picturesque, if damp, features of the property. The farm at the centre of this case was known, before 1899, as Coldham's Farm. It stood in the parish of Clavering, a modest agricultural holding surrounded by its moat, accessible by a lane some distance from the nearest village centre. The house itself was of no great size or grandeur, a working farmhouse rather than a gentleman's residence, and its isolation was a practical consequence of its situation rather than any deliberate seclusion. Pony traps were the ordinary means of transport for anyone living in such a district who needed to reach a market town, and journeys to Stansted or Saffron Walden for provisions were a routine part of rural domestic life. It was into this setting that Camille Holland arrived in the spring of 1899, following her purchase of the property. Her arrival in rural Essex followed a period spent, by one account, in London, where she had been living in the manner common to a woman of her means and situation, in lodgings and boarding establishments, rather than a permanent household of her own. The record indicates that she had, over the course of her adult life, moved between various such residences, and that she possessed artistic inclination, being recorded as a painter of watercolour landscapes. This detail, though modest, is consistent with the picture of a woman of independent temperament and some private income, occupying her time as she saw fit rather than being bound to the domestic obligations of marriage or family management. Her financial position by 1899 was a comfortable one for a single woman of the period. Her estate, variously recorded as between £6,000 and £7,000, generated an annual income in the region of £300 to £400, a sum sufficient to sustain an independent household without need of employment. The origin of this money is recorded as an inheritance connected to a relative in India, which passed to an aunt before descending to Camille Holland herself upon that aunt's death. She had for a period resided with this aunt in Liverpool, where the aunt kept a school for girls, and had subsequently moved to London when the aunt's professional life came to its close. Whatever uncertainty attaches to the earliest chapters of her life, the record is consistent on this point. By the time she reached her middle 50s, she was a woman managing her own stocks and shares, without reliance on a husband, a trustee, or a male relative to conduct her financial affairs. This was not the universal condition of women in her situation and period, and it marks her as someone of practical competence and a degree of independence uncommon among her contemporaries. It was against this backdrop of comfortable, self-directed independence that she encountered the man who would become the central figure of the remainder of her life. The two met in London in the autumn of 1898. The exact location of that meeting is not established with certainty in the surviving accounts, which differ as to whether the introduction occurred at a public exhibition or within a boarding house, and the present account does not attempt to resolve that discrepancy. What followed, however, is documented with greater consistency. Within a matter of months of this meeting, Camille Holland had entered into a domestic arrangement with a man calling himself her husband, though no record of any legal marriage between them exists. The two would live together at Clavering under the names of Mr. and Mrs. Dougal, a domestic fiction rather than a legal fact, and one that concealed a considerably more complicated history on the part of her companion. The man in question was Samuel Herbert Dougal, and the record of his life prior to his meeting with Camille Holland is substantial enough to warrant its own account before the narrative returns to the farm at Clavering. He was born on the 15th of May 1847 in Bow in the East End of London, the eldest son of Samuel Dredge Dougal and his wife Maria Josephine Thompson. As a young man, he enlisted in the Royal Engineers, joining at the age of 19 for a term of service that was later extended to 21 years. His military career involved technical and survey work, including duties connected to the Ordnance Survey in Wales, and he rose during his service to the rank of Quartermaster Sergeant. From 1897 he was posted to Halifax in Nova Scotia, where his duties included work connected to the modernisation of the garrison and to photographic recording. He remained in that post until his discharge from the army in March of 1887. It was during his years of military service in Canada that the first indications of a troubling pattern in his personal life appear in the record. He had married Martha Griffiths in 1869, in Mould in Flintshire, and the couple remained together through the years of his Canadian posting. In June of 1885, Martha Dougal died suddenly in Halifax, having shown no prior record of serious illness. Her death was officially attributed to tuberculosis, though the circumstances surrounding it were regarded with suspicion by some at the time, a suspicion that was never translated into any formal investigation or charge. Only 2 months later, in August of 1885, Dougal married again, to a woman named Mary Herberta Boyd. This second marriage proved shorter still. Mary Dougal died in October of 1885, a mere 3 months after the wedding, her death attributed in one account to the consumption of poisonous oysters. She was buried without significant delay at Fort Massey Cemetery in Halifax. As with the death of his first wife, no formal investigation into the circumstances of this second death is recorded, and the case did not proceed beyond private suspicion. It should be stated plainly that these two deaths, while they form part of the documented pattern of Dougal's life and are relevant to any account of his character and conduct, were never examined as homicides by the authorities of the day and cannot be presented as established murders. They stand in the record as suspicious but unproven. Following his discharge from the army, Dougal's conduct did not improve. He was convicted of forgery, having stolen and forged cheques, an offence connected by one account to the name of Lord Wolseley, and was sentenced to 12 months of hard labour at Pentonville Prison. During the course of that sentence, he feigned a suicide attempt, a deception that resulted in his transfer to Cane Hill Lunatic Asylum, from which he was discharged on the 8th of December 1896, having been declared perfectly sane. A separate account records a further Old Bailey conviction for forgery in 1897, carrying a sentence of 1 year, though whether this refers to the same episode described differently or to a distinct second offence is not resolved in the sources available, and the present account does not attempt to adjudicate between them. What can be stated with confidence is that by the time he met Camille Holland in the autumn of 1898, Samuel Dougal carried a documented record of forgery and criminal deception, alongside 2 prior marriages that had ended in the sudden and unexplained deaths of his wives within months of each vows being exchanged. There is a further complication to the domestic arrangement that Dougal entered into with Camille Holland at Clavering. According to the record, Dougal had married a woman named Sarah Henrietta White in 1892 and remained legally bound to her at the time he began his relationship with Camille Holland. The arrangement under which he and Camille Holland lived together as husband and wife at the farm in Clavering was, therefore, not merely unofficial but bigamous in substance, a fiction constructed on top of an existing and undissolved legal marriage. Camille Holland, so far as the record indicates, had no knowledge of this prior marriage, and entered into her domestic arrangements with Dougal, believing it to carry whatever legitimacy such an arrangement could carry. It was in this context that the purchase of the Essex farm took place. Camille Holland funded the acquisition of Coldham's farm herself, and the record notes a detail of some significance. She insisted that the contract of purchase be made out in her own name. This was not a woman handing over her money and her judgment without precaution. It was, on the contrary, an ordinary and prudent legal step, consistent with her established habit of managing her own financial affairs. The property was purchased in the early months of 1899, and while the arrangements were being finalised, the couple lodged briefly at Hassocks and subsequently at Saffron Walden. They moved into the farm, by then renamed Moat House Farm, in the latter part of April of 1899, with the exact date recorded variously as the 22nd or the 24th of the month. A maidservant, recorded in some accounts under the name Florence Havies, was engaged to the household in the middle of May, joining the establishment only days before the events that would end Camille Holland's life. The precaution she had taken in placing the purchase contract in her own name would prove, in the end, insufficient to protect her, not because the precaution itself was flawed, but because what followed was not a contest fought within the law. It was a forgery of her signature, conducted after her death, that defeated the safeguard she had put in place while she was alive. That, however, belongs to a later stage of this account. In the spring of 1899, the household at Moat House Farm consisted of 2 people living under a fiction of marriage in a remote and moated farmhouse in rural Essex, with a newly engaged servant only beginning to learn the routines of the house. The 3 weeks that followed the couple's move into Moat House Farm passed, so far as the surviving record indicates, without any outward disturbance. The household settled into the ordinary rhythms of rural domestic life. Provisions were purchased in the nearby market towns. The farm itself was undergoing certain alterations, among them work connected to the filling in of drainage ditches near the moat that gave the property its name, work that was at the time unremarkable, the sort of practical improvement any newly acquired farm property might require. Camille Holland, by every indication in the record, continued to conduct herself as an independent woman of means, corresponding with relatives and managing her financial affairs, unaware that the man she believed to be her husband carried behind him a record of forgery, bigamy, and 2 prior marriages that had ended abruptly in death. On Friday the 19th of May, 1899, Camille Holland and Samuel Dougal set out together from the farm in the Pony Trap, bound for the market town of Stansted. The purpose of the outing was an ordinary one, a shopping expedition of the kind that would have been unremarkable in any week of their residence at the farm. They completed their business in the town and began the return journey to Moat House Farm. It was upon their return in the vicinity of the coach house at the farm itself that Camille Holland was shot in the head at close range. She did not survive the wound. She was never seen alive again by anyone outside the household, and the man with whom she had shared her home for less than a month would spend the following 4 years telling an evolving and inconsistent account of her whereabouts to those who asked. The maidservant then residing at the farm was told in the days that followed that Camille Holland had gone to London. Later the account shifted and she was said to be travelling. These explanations were not fixed or consistent, but changed according to the circumstances of whoever was asking, a pattern that would, in time, prove to be one of the more telling indications of what had actually taken place. Correspondence with Camille Holland's own relatives in the months that followed maintained a similar fiction, describing her as absent and unavailable rather than accounting for her in any definite way. For the relatives who received these accounts, the explanation was, for a considerable time, accepted without serious challenge. She had been a woman of independent habits before her association with Dougal, given to moving between residences and maintaining her own schedule, and an extended absence, however unusual, was not on its face impossible to credit. For nearly 4 years, this arrangement persisted largely undisturbed. Samuel Dougal remained at Moat House Farm, occupying the property and drawing upon Camille Holland's financial resources as though she remained alive and simply absent. He forged her signature upon cheques and upon transfers of her shares, extracting over the course of those years a sum approaching £6,000 from an estate that had, before his intervention, been carefully and independently managed by the woman to whom it belonged. He lived in effect as a man of means upon money that was not his, in a house that had been purchased with funds that were not his, under a name to which he held no legal claim. The household at Moat House Farm did not remain static during these years. A succession of other women passed through the property while Dougal occupied it. One maidservant, unnamed in the surviving record, is reported in a single account to have left her position following an incident of a sexually threatening character, a detail that rests on limited corroboration and is recorded here only for the sake of completeness. A servant named Georgina Cranwell, known also as Kate, entered the household and became, over time, considerably more than a domestic employee, bearing a child by Dougal. A further woman, Emily Maria Booty, is recorded as having been deceived and mistreated by him during this same period, and another, named Bessie Stedman, is recorded in one account as having suffered similar treatment before returning to Canada. Each of these women, in turn, occupied a position within the household that Camille Holland herself had once held, and each, so far as the record indicates, did so without any knowledge of what had actually become of the woman whose money sustained the farm and whose name Dougal continued, in various forms, to invoke. It was Georgina Cranwell whose actions ultimately brought this arrangement to an end. On the 27th of January, 1903, she made application for an affiliation order, a legal mechanism by which a mother could seek financial support from the father of her child, naming Samuel Dougal as the father of hers. The proceedings connected to this application required an examination of Dougal's circumstances and his means, and it was in the course of this examination that questions began to be raised about the woman he had once presented as his wife. It became apparent in the course of these inquiries that no record existed of any marriage between Samuel Dougal and Camille Holland, and further, that Camille Holland herself had not been seen by anyone outside the household for a period approaching 4 years, despite the fact that financial transactions continued to be made, apparently upon her authority, throughout that time. This discrepancy, once identified, drew the attention of those examining Dougal's affairs to the pattern of transactions that had taken place since May of 1899. A closer review of the cheques and share transfers conducted in Camille Holland's name over the preceding years revealed irregularities consistent with forgery rather than with genuine instruction from the woman whose signature they bore. One account further records that Dougal's eventual arrest was hastened by an attempt on his part to exchange £10 notes at the Bank of England, notes that were subsequently traced back to the fraudulent transactions connected to Camille Holland's estate. Whatever the precise sequence by which suspicion accumulated, the outcome was the same. In March of 1903, Samuel Dougal was arrested on charges connected to forgery, a legal proceeding that would, within a matter of weeks, expand into something considerably graver. The investigation into Camille Holland's disappearance was formally opened in the wake of this arrest, and the officers assigned to the case turned their attention to the farm at Clavering and to the question of what had actually become of the woman who had purchased it. The record of exactly which officers led this investigation and in what capacity is not entirely consistent across the sources that survive. A Superintendent Pryke is recorded as having conducted an early interview with Dougal, in the course of which Dougal offered the explanation that he had left Camille Holland at Stansted railway station some years before, a claim that appears to have satisfied no one who examined it closely. A Superintendent Daniels is credited in materials donated to a local historical society by his own descendants, with leading the broader investigation. A further officer, recorded variously as Inspector Marsden, or by the alternative spelling Marden, is credited with having located a nephew of Camille Holland and with securing confirmation that the cheques drawn upon her accounts were, in fact, forged, a finding that appears to have been decisive in securing Dougal's arrest on the more serious charge that would follow. Whether these were 3 officers occupying genuinely distinct roles, or whether some of these names reflect variant spellings of the same individual across different newspaper accounts, is not something the surviving record resolves with certainty, and this account does not attempt to adjudicate the question further than to note it. With Dougal in custody, attention turned to the grounds of Moat House Farm itself, and in April of 1903, officers began a physical search of the property in an effort to determine whether Camille Holland's remains might be found somewhere upon the land she had purchased 4 years before. The search proved a considerable undertaking. Officers and labourers dug through the farmyard and the surrounding grounds over a period of weeks, turning what had been ordinary agricultural land into what one contemporary account described as a quagmire. The ground churned and waterlogged from the sustained digging and from the wet Essex spring. The search drew substantial public attention, and crowds gathered at the site to observe the proceedings, some arriving from considerable distances by charabanc. The horse-drawn or early motorised omnibuses of the period pressed into service for the occasion. As the weeks passed without result, the size of these crowds diminished, the novelty of the spectacle giving way to the tedium of watching men dig through mud without evident progress. Early in the course of this search, diggers uncovered a burned skull, a discovery that briefly raised the possibility that the search had reached its object. Examination established, however, that this skull predated Camille Holland's residence at the farm and had no connection to the case under investigation. The search continued. The breakthrough, when it came, arose from a reconsideration of the alterations that had been made to the farm's drainage system in the period immediately following Camille Holland's disappearance. It was recalled or suggested that Dougal had been engaged in filling in certain drainage trenches near the farm's moat in the weeks after Camille Holland was last seen. Ordinary agricultural improvement work on its face, but work that had taken place at a suspiciously convenient moment. Officers turned their attention to these filled trenches, and on the 27th of April 1903, a labourer engaged in the search uncovered a body buried within one of them. After nearly 4 years in which Camille Holland had been presumed, by those who thought of her at all, to be simply travelling or absent, her remains had been found within a short distance of the house she had purchased and never had the opportunity to properly inhabit. Officers dispatched to Moat House Farm following the discovery proceeded with the careful methods appropriate to a body that had lain concealed for so long a period. The remains were removed from the drainage trench in which they had been found and conveyed for examination. The work of extraction itself demanding considerable caution given the condition of the ground and the length of time that had passed since the body had first been placed there. Nearly 4 years of burial in wet Essex clay had left the remains in a state of severe decomposition. The facial features degraded to a point well beyond any possibility of recognition by sight. Whoever this had once been, no one who looked upon the remains directly could say with certainty who she was. The task of identification therefore fell not to appearance but to physical evidence recovered alongside the body. Among the effects examined were a pair of boots, and it was through these boots that identification was ultimately achieved. Camille Holland had been known among those who were acquainted with her for the unusually small size of her feet, a feature described in one account as her particular pride. She wore boots made half a size smaller than standard stock sizes permitted, an irregularity that meant her footwear was necessarily custom-made rather than purchased ready-fitted. The boots recovered with the remains were traced to a bootmaker named Mould of the Edgware Road in London, who examined the boots and identified them as his own work. He stated that the boots were lined with lambswool and marked internally with brass tacks arranged to form the letter M, a detail of his own construction, and he further stated that he had only one customer for whom he made boots of that particular style and dimension. On the strength of this evidence, the remains recovered from the drainage trench at Moat House Farm were identified as those of Camille Holland. The post-mortem examination established that death had resulted from a single gunshot wound to the head, a finding consistent with the account, later obtained, of what had taken place near the coach house on the day she was last seen alive. No named physician conducting this examination appears in the sources available for this account, a gap in the surviving record that should be noted rather than filled with invention. The bullet responsible for the wound was recovered during the course of the post-mortem examination, though no record survives identifying the type or calibre of weapon from which it had been fired, and this account does not speculate on a detail the record itself does not supply. With identification established and a cause of death confirmed, the case against Samuel Dougal proceeded toward formal criminal proceedings. He was charged with the murder of Camille Holland on the 22nd of June, 1903, a charge that superseded the forgery proceedings under which he had originally been detained. The public reaction to these developments was considerable. As Dougal was moved between locations in the course of the legal proceedings against him, he was met on occasion by hostile crowds, described in one account as greeting him with booing and hissing, a plain expression of public sentiment against a man whose forged signatures and inconsistent explanations had, over 4 years, concealed the killing of the woman whose money had sustained him throughout that period. The trial of Samuel Dougal opened at Chelmsford Assizes, the county town of Essex, before Mr. Justice Wright. The names of the barristers who conducted the prosecution and the defence in this case are not established in the sources available for this account, and no attempt is made here to supply them. The proceedings drew upon the accumulated evidence of the investigation, including the testimony connected to the discovery of the body, the identification through the boots supplied by the bootmaker Mould, the medical findings regarding the cause of death, and the documented record of forged financial transactions carried out in Camille Holland's name across the nearly 4 years following her death. The jury heard, in addition, evidence bearing on Dougal's own conduct and circumstances during those years, the household he had maintained at the farm, and the shifting explanations he had offered to those who inquired after the woman he claimed as his wife. The trial concluded on the 23rd of June, 1903, with a unanimous verdict of guilty returned by the jury. The court proceeded to sentencing without delay, and Samuel Dougal was sentenced to death. The mandatory sentence for conviction of wilful murder, under the law, then in force. He was conveyed following his conviction to Chelmsford Prison, there to await the carrying out of that sentence. The interval between sentencing and execution followed the ordinary procedure of the period, during which no reprieve was granted, and no further legal challenge altered the outcome of the trial. Samuel Dougal was executed by hanging at Chelmsford Prison on the 14th of July, 1903. The execution was carried out by William Billington, a member of a family that had, across successive generations, supplied several of the executioners employed by the English prison service during this period. 2 accounts of Dougal's final moments survive, and while they differ in their particulars, they agree in substance. One record describes the prison chaplain putting a direct question to him in the moments before the sentence was carried out, asking whether he was guilty of the crime for which he had been condemned, and repeating the question when no immediate answer was given. According to this account, Dougal replied in a low but clear voice with a single word, "Guilty," after which he submitted to the remaining preparations without further protest or comment. A second independent account states more simply that in the second before the drop he finally confessed. The precise wording attributed to him in these 2 accounts is not identical, and this record does not present either as a verified verbatim transcript. What can be stated with confidence on the strength of 2 separate sources is that in the final moment before his execution, Samuel Dougal acknowledged his guilt in the killing of Camille Holland, bringing to a close, in this final and unambiguous admission, 4 years during which he had never once told the truth about what had become of her. The case left behind it a substantial body of documentation, preserved in the years that followed by institutions with a direct connection to the district in which it had unfolded. The Essex Police Museum maintains a record of the case among its historical files, drawing on the original investigative materials connected to the search of Moat House Farm and the identification of Camille Holland's remains. Saffron Walden Museum, in the town where the couple had briefly lodged before their move to the farm, received in 2009 a donation of primary documents connected to the case from descendants of Superintendent Daniels, one of the officers credited with leading the original investigation. These materials, brought together decades after the events they describe, have allowed local historians to examine the case with a degree of documentary detail uncommon for a crime of this age and this regional scope. The case has also received sustained attention in published form. An early narrative account, titled The Secret of the Moat Farm, was produced in the years following the trial, offering a detailed contemporary telling of the case drawn from newspaper reporting and courtroom testimony of the period. In more recent years, a fuller modern treatment has appeared under the title The Moat Farm Mystery, examining Samuel Dougal's life and criminal history at book length, and drawing on newspaper archives to reconstruct the case in detail. No film adaptation television documentary, or notable podcast treatment of the case has been identified in the course of this account's preparation, and the case has remained, in the century and more since the trial, a matter of regional historical record rather than a fixture of wider popular culture. Within Essex itself, the case has retained a distinct place in the county's criminal history, remembered less for any single dramatic revelation than for the sheer duration of the deception that sustained it. 4 years is a considerable span of time for a man to live openly in a settled rural community, upon the estate of a woman he had killed, drawing on her accounts, occupying her house, and answering to her name on her behalf, without the truth surfacing through any ordinary channel of suspicion or inquiry. It was not vigilance or scrutiny that finally exposed the case, but an unrelated legal proceeding brought by a woman seeking support for her child that incidentally uncovered the absence no one else had thought to formally question. The physical search of the farm grounds in the spring of 1903 and the crowds it drew to a quiet stretch of Essex farmland remain a part of the local memory of the case, an image of ordinary agricultural land turned for several weeks into a site of public spectacle and official excavation. The record also preserves something of the wider context in which the case unfolded, a context bearing directly upon Camille Holland's own situation and the vulnerability that situation carried. She had managed her own financial affairs competently and had taken the ordinary legal precaution of placing the farm's purchase contract in her own name, a precaution that reflected genuine independence of mind rather than passivity or naivety, and yet that independence, once it was folded into a shared household with a man whose true history she did not know, offered her no protection against the particular and singular act of violence that ended her life. The safeguard of legal ownership meant a great deal against ordinary financial risk. It meant nothing at all against a companion who was prepared, within 3 weeks of taking up residence in the house her money had purchased, to shoot her and bury her in a drainage trench. He had begun digging for exactly that purpose under the cover of ordinary farm improvements. The conclusion of the trial did not, of itself, settle every matter connected to the case, and certain threads regarding its aftermath merit their own record. The farm at Clavering, having served as the site both of the killing and of its 4-year concealment, passed out of Dougal's possession entirely upon his conviction. The estate that Camille Holland had purchased with her own money, reverting, in whatever fashion the law of the period allowed, toward her own relatives, rather than remaining in the hands of the man who had murdered her for it. The considerable sum he had extracted through forged cheques and share transfers over the preceding 4 years, understood to approach £6,000, was by that point largely spent or otherwise dispersed, the household at Moat House Farm having been maintained throughout that period on funds that were, in the strictest sense, never legitimately his to use. The woman to whom Dougal remained legally married throughout the period of his relationship with Camille Holland, Sarah Henrietta White, does not feature further in the record once the criminal proceedings against her husband had run their course. No account survives of her reaction to the revelation that the man she had married in 1892 had, within a matter of years, taken up residence with another woman under a fiction of marriage, murdered that woman, and lived upon her money for nearly 4 years while the truth remained concealed from everyone, including, so far as the record indicates, from his own lawful wife. This absence in the record is noted rather than filled, in keeping with the practice of this account of stating plainly where the documentary trail runs out, rather than supplying an ending the sources themselves do not provide. The moat that gave the farm its later name, and the drainage trenches that ran near it, retained after 1903 an association with the case that outlasted any purely agricultural purpose the features had originally served. What had been before the events of 1899 an unremarkable feature of a working Essex farmstead The kind of moated holdings scattered without particular distinction across this part of the county became afterward a sight inseparable in local memory from the 4 years during which a murdered woman lay buried within a few dozen yards of the house that bore her purchase money and, for a time, her name. Visitors to the district in the years following the trial are recorded in local historical materials as having sought out the farm specifically on account of the case, a form of attention that a modest agricultural property in a sparsely populated parish would not otherwise have attracted. The child born to Georgina Cranwell, whose application for financial support in January of 1903 had set in motion the inquiries that ultimately exposed the case, does not appear further in the surviving record consulted for this account. The affiliation proceedings that named Samuel Dougal as the father were themselves overtaken by the far graver charge that followed within months, and no further trace of the outcome of the original support application or of the subsequent life of the child at its centre has been located. It stands as one further thread left open by a case in which the central crime was, in the end, definitively resolved, while a number of its surrounding circumstances, the precise roles of individual investigating officers, the exact site and manner of Camille Holland's first meeting with the man who killed her, the fullest account of her own early life, remain only partially recovered from the documentary record that survives. What the record does establish, without any such ambiguity, is the shape of the deception that Samuel Dougal sustained across those 4 years at Clavering, a deception remarkable less for its sophistication than for its sheer duration. He did not attempt an elaborate story capable of withstanding close examination. He offered instead a series of loosely connected explanations: that Camille Holland had gone to London, that she was travelling, that she had been left at Stansted railway station. Explanations that shifted according to the listener and the moment, and that were accepted for years, not because they were convincing, but because no one in a position to challenge them had sufficient cause to try. A woman of independent habits, known to move between residences and to keep her own counsel, could be absent for a very long time before her absence became, in the eyes of those around her, a matter demanding formal inquiry. It was not the strength of Dougal's account that protected him through those 4 years. It was the ordinary reluctance of family, neighbours and tradespeople to press a question that no single one of them had sufficient standing or sufficient certainty to insist upon answering. Chelmsford itself, the county town in which the trial was conducted, was in 1903 a modest cathedral and market town on the River Chelmer, its shire hall serving as the seat of the Essex Assizes for cases of the gravest character drawn from across the county. The courtroom in which Samuel Dougal stood trial was not a large chamber by the standards of the Old Bailey or the higher London courts, and the proceedings against him, given the considerable public interest the case had already generated through the weeks of digging at Clavering, drew crowds to the streets surrounding the Shire Hall greater than the building itself could accommodate. Reports from the period describe members of the public queuing from early in the morning in hope of securing one of the limited seats allotted to spectators, a level of interest consistent with the case's standing by the summer of 1903 as one of the most closely followed criminal matters in the county's recent history. The proceedings themselves extended across more than a single day. The volume of evidence connected to nearly 4 years of financial transactions, the details of the search at the farm, and the medical and identification evidence, all requiring careful presentation before the court. Witnesses called in the course of the trial included those connected with the discovery of the body at Clavering, those able to speak to the financial irregularities uncovered in the course of the investigation, and the bootmaker, Mould, whose testimony regarding the boots recovered with the remains carried particular weight in establishing beyond serious doubt the identity of the woman whose death the court had been convened to examine. Throughout the proceedings, Samuel Dougal maintained, according to the surviving accounts of the trial, a composed and largely unemotional bearing, offering no confession and mounting no account of the events at the farm that might have contradicted the case assembled against him by the prosecution. The jury's deliberation concluded with the unanimous verdict already recorded, and the sentence of death was pronounced in the customary form used by the courts of the period. A formal pronouncement read into the record of the assizes before Dougal was removed from the dock to begin the weeks of confinement that would precede his execution. The interval between conviction and execution, a matter of some 3 weeks under the standard practice of the period, was occupied on the part of the condemned man with the ordinary routines of a Victorian prison, awaiting the carrying out of a capital sentence, routines that afforded little scope for any final public statement beyond what the prison chaplain might record of his private conduct and disposition in his last days. Outside the walls of Chelmsford Prison, on the morning of the 14th of July, a crowd gathered in the street beyond the prison gate, as was customary at executions of notorious offenders during this period. A public still without access to the interior of the proceedings, but drawn nonetheless to stand near the place where a sentence of the law was being carried into effect. The formal notice of execution, posted upon the prison gate once the sentence had been completed, served as the customary public confirmation that the case in its narrowest legal sense had reached its conclusion. It was this notice, rather than any statement from within the prison walls, that informed the waiting crowd that Samuel Dougal was dead. The correspondence that had passed in the years before his exposure between Dougal and Camille Holland's own relatives forms a further thread within the documentary record of the case, illustrating in concrete terms how the deception was sustained across such a long period without collapsing under its own inconsistencies. Letters purporting to explain her continued absence, or in some instances letters that Dougal represented as having been written on her behalf or forwarded from her, were sufficient to satisfy relatives who had no ready means of independently verifying her whereabouts and no particular cause, in the absence of any contrary evidence, to suspect that harm had come to her. It was only once the affiliation proceedings of January 1903 had drawn official attention to the question of her whereabouts that a nephew of Camille Holland was traced and consulted, his evidence proving material to the identification of the forged financial instruments that had for nearly 4 years sustained the fiction of her continued life. The parish records of Clavering itself, examined in the course of the investigation, offered no evidence of any marriage between Camille Holland and Samuel Dougal, a fact that, once established, removed any remaining basis for treating their domestic arrangement as anything other than the fiction it had always been. This absence of a marriage record, combined with the discovery of Dougal's undissolved legal marriage to Sarah Henrietta White, meant that whatever social standing the arrangement at Moat House Farm had carried among those who knew the couple locally rested entirely upon appearance rather than upon any legal foundation. Neighbours and tradespeople in the district who had dealt with the couple as Mr. and Mrs. Dougal over the preceding 4 years had done so in good faith, extending to the arrangement the ordinary courtesy owed to a married household, unaware that the underlying claim to that status had no standing whatsoever in law. Once identification had been confirmed and the coronial and legal processes connected to the discovery of her remains had run their course, arrangements were made for Camille Holland's burial, bringing to a close, in the most literal sense, the 4 years during which her body had lain, concealed in the drainage trench near the moat that gave the farm its name. The funeral took place in the district with which her final months of life had been so briefly and so fatally connected, attended by those relatives who had, for so long, believed her simply absent rather than dead, and who now confronted, in the delayed and belated fact of her funeral, the true length of the deception that had been practiced upon them. No detailed account of the funeral service itself survives in the sources examined for this record, and this narrative does not supply particulars the documentary trail does not offer. What can be said is that the burial marked for her family the formal and long-delayed acknowledgement of a death that had in fact occurred nearly 4 years before, on an ordinary afternoon in May, following an unremarkable shopping trip to a market town she had visited without any premonition that she would not return from it in the way she expected. The tradespeople of Stanstead and Saffron Walden, the towns to which the household at Moat House Farm had turned for its ordinary provisioning across the 4 years of Dougal's occupancy, feature in the record chiefly through the transactions that sustained the fiction of a continuing household, purchases of goods, settlement of accounts, and the general commerce of rural life that gave no outward indication that the woman in whose name the farm had been purchased was no longer living. Shopkeepers in these towns would have known the household as customers of a generally unremarkable character, a farming couple of some apparent means, whose custom was accepted in the ordinary course of trade without any occasion for the kind of scrutiny that might have raised early questions about the true state of affairs at the farm. It was not until the financial irregularities connected to Camille Holland's own securities and bank accounts came under examination in 1903 that the broader pattern of deception became visible. The ordinary transactions of daily provisioning in Stanstead and Saffron Walden having offered no signal, on their own, of anything amiss. The postal service of the period, upon which the correspondence maintaining contact with Camille Holland's relatives depended, operated with a regularity and reliability that in this instance served the purposes of concealment rather than connection. Letters dispatched from the farm, or represented as having originated with Camille Holland herself, moved through the ordinary channels of the Royal Mail with no more scrutiny than any other item of correspondence of the period received, a system built for efficient and trusted communication, becoming, in the hands of a man practised in forgery, an instrument by which an absence of nearly 4 years could be rendered, to those receiving the letters, indistinguishable from an unusually extended but otherwise unremarkable period of travel and separation. The verdict was entered. The sentence was served. The case closed in 1903. The record remained. That is where the record of the second case ends. What follows turns to a third and final account, set some years earlier than the one just closed, in a different corner of London entirely, and concerned with a woman whose life was built around property rather than performance or persuasion. The question at the centre of this last case is not whether a crime occurred, but whether the record that closed it was ever fully sound. The case of Mary Emslie begins in Stepney, in the East End of London, in the summer of 1860. Stepney at this date was one of a cluster of densely populated districts lying east of the City of London, bounded loosely by Bowen Mile End to the north and east, Bethnal Green to the north, and the river and its wharves to the south. The parish had grown rapidly over the preceding decades as London's population expanded eastward, drawing in dock labourers, artisans, small tradesmen, and a substantial population of the casually employed, all housed in terraces of modest brick dwellings that had been thrown up, street after street, to meet the demand. It was not a fashionable district, nor a particularly notorious one. It was, in the main, a working district, its streets lined with small shops, workshops, and rented houses, its rhythms set by the tides of the nearby docks and by the weekly cycle of wages earned and rents paid. Grove Road, where Mary Emslie made her home, ran through this landscape as one street among many, its houses modest but respectable, occupied by tenants of limited means who paid their rent by the week. The house at number 9 was, by the accounts that survive, either 2 or 3 stories in height, unremarkable from the outside, distinguished from its neighbours chiefly by the fact that its owner lived there alone. This was itself unusual. A woman of Mary Emslie's means, by 1860, the owner of a considerable portfolio of rented houses spread across Stratford, Bow, Bethnal Green, Mile End, and Stepney itself, might have been expected to keep at least one servant. She kept none. She managed her properties herself, collected her own rents in person, going from door to door across several districts to gather what was owed her, and she permitted almost no one across her own threshold. The precise scale of Mary Emsley's property holdings is not established with certainty in the surviving record. Contemporary accounts describe her as the owner of considerable house property, without specifying an exact number of dwellings, and later tellings of the case have sometimes offered specific figures that cannot be verified against a primary source. What can be said is that her holdings were substantial enough to have made her, by the standards of her street and her neighbours, a woman of real wealth, and that the management of that wealth consumed her days. She walked from house to house, street to street, collecting sums that were often small individually, but considerable in aggregate, and she was known to deal firmly, even harshly, with tenants who fell behind. Non-payment was met with eviction rather than leniency. This reputation, combined with her habit of living alone and admitting almost no one to her house, gave her a particular standing among her neighbours, who regarded her, by the accounts that survive, as grim, stern, and somewhat eccentric, an object of curiosity as much as of ordinary acquaintance. Mary Emsley's early life is not preserved in the sources available for this account. Her maiden name has not been established. Her birth year is given in a single source as approximately 1790, which would have made her about 70 years of age at the time of her death, but this figure is not independently confirmed and should be regarded as an estimate rather than a documented fact. What is established is her marriage to John Emsley, a builder from whom she came into possession of the greater part of her property holdings. The date of John Emsley's death and the length of the marriage that preceded it are not recorded in the sources consulted for this account. By the time the case that bears her name begins, Mary Emsley had been a widow for some period of unknown duration, and the property that had come to her through her marriage had become, in effect, her occupation. She was not a woman of leisure. She was a landlady in the fullest sense of the word, personally responsible for the collection of her own income, the maintenance of her own houses, and the management of her own tenants, a role she appears to have carried out with considerable diligence and very little softness. The absence of a servant in a household of her evident means was noted by those who knew her, and it appears to have been a matter of deliberate frugality rather than necessity. She could, by the scale of her holdings, have afforded domestic help. She chose instead to live and work alone, opening her door rarely, and trusting few people with knowledge of her habits or her movements. This caution was not without foundation. A woman of her wealth, living alone, collecting cash rents in person across several districts, was in a position of some exposure, and it appears that she was at least partially aware of this. She was, by the accounts that survive, security conscious in her habits, guarded with visitors, and disinclined to admit workmen or tradesmen to her house without particular cause. It was, nonetheless, workmen and tradesmen who had occasion to know her. As the owner of a substantial portfolio of rented houses, Mary Emsley required periodic repairs, and among those who had performed such work for her on an irregular basis was a plasterer by the name of James Mullins, a man in his 50s who had at one time served with the Irish Constabulary before coming to London. The nature of his employment with her, irregular rather than continuous, meant that he had some knowledge of her habits, her properties, and the manner in which she conducted her affairs, knowledge that would come to bear directly on the events of August 1860. Another man who performed occasional work for her, a cobbler and rent collector named Walter M., would also come to figure in the case, though in a manner very different from what either he or Mullins might have anticipated. By the second week of August 1860, Mary Emsley's routine had not altered from its established pattern. she continued to walk her rounds, collecting rent from her tenants across Stratford, Bow, Bethnal Green and Mile End, returning each evening to the house on Grove Road, where she lived without company and without a servant to mark her comings and goings. Her neighbours, accustomed to seeing little of her beyond these routine movements, had no particular reason to remark upon anything unusual in her conduct during this period. She was, so far as the record establishes, following the same course she had followed for years, collecting what was owed her, dealing with her tenants according to her usual manner, and returning each night to a house that she occupied entirely alone. This pattern, established over years and known to at least some of those who worked for her irregularly, formed the circumstances into which the events of the 13th of August would intrude. On the evening of Monday, the 13th of August 1860, Mary Emsley was seen by neighbours at the window of her bedroom at No. 9 Grove Road at approximately 7 o'clock. This sighting would prove, in the record that survives, to be the last confirmed occasion on which she was seen alive. What happened inside the house at 9 Grove Road in the hours that followed is not established by any surviving eyewitness account. No one came forward to describe her movements after that hour, and no account exists of visitors received or admitted that evening. The house, as was her habit, offered little visibility into her affairs from the outside. Its owner, accustomed to conducting her business behind a closed door, and the street outside gave no indication, in the days that immediately followed, that anything within had gone amiss. It was the ordinary rhythm of the street itself that eventually raised concern. Mary Emsley's neighbours were accustomed to a household that, while reclusive, nonetheless showed the ordinary signs of habitation: blinds raised in the morning and lowered at night, small movements that indicated a woman going about her business behind her own windows. As the days following the 13th of August passed, this rhythm ceased. The blinds at No. 9 Grove Road did not move. There was no sign of Mary Emsley at her window, no indication that she had gone out on her rounds or returned from them, and no answer to be had at her door. For a woman known to guard her privacy as closely as she did, an absence of activity was not immediately alarming in itself, but as one day gave way to another, without any change in the appearance of the house, the silence began to draw notice from those who lived nearby. By the latter part of that week, the concern among her neighbours had grown sufficient to prompt action. The unmoved blinds, which might on any single day have meant nothing, had by Friday, the 17th of August, become impossible to explain by any ordinary account of her habits. It was this concern, arising not from any direct evidence of wrongdoing, but simply from the interruption of an established and closely observed routine, that led to the discovery which would open the investigation into her death. The circumstances leading up to that discovery establish a woman whose life was ordered, insular, and largely self-contained, whose wealth was real but carefully guarded, and whose isolation, whether by temperament or by design, left her without anyone positioned to notice her absence until the outward signs of her household had gone still for the better part of 4 days. The house at 9 Grove Road was entered on Friday the 17th of August, 1860. What was found inside would set in motion an investigation, a trial, and an execution, and would leave behind a question that has never been fully settled in the historical record, a question that a future generation would return to more than once in the decades that followed. The house at 9 Grove Road was opened by a constable summoned from the local station, accompanied by 2 neighbours who had grown sufficiently alarmed by the stillness of the property to insist that someone force an entry. The front door was found secured, access was gained through a side or rear passage, and the interior was found in a state that gave no immediate answer to what had become of its owner. The ground floor rooms were undisturbed in their general appearance, furnished plainly, showing no obvious sign of a struggle or of forced entry from the outside. It was only upon proceeding to the upper story that the search party came upon the room in which Mary Emsley had, for some years, stored rolls of wallpaper and other materials connected with the maintenance of her properties, and it was there among the stacked paper and the ordinary clutter of a working landlady's storage, that her body was found. She was lying in a position that indicated she had been struck down where she stood or had fallen only a short distance from where the blows were delivered. The room itself bore marks consistent with a violent struggle having taken place, though the details of the disturbance were, in the accounts that survive, described only in general terms. A bloody impression of a boot was later noted near the door of the room, a detail that would come to bear on the investigation that followed. The persons who made the discovery did not disturb the scene beyond what was necessary to confirm that Mary Emslie was dead, and word was sent at once to the police. The condition of the rest of the house, once examined, offered an early indication of the nature of the crime. Sums of rent money, which a woman of her habits would ordinarily have kept about the premises, were found untouched in certain parts of the house, while other items were found to be missing, among them a gold pencil case that Mary Emslie was known to have kept. This combination, money left in place in some rooms while particular items had been taken, suggested to those who examined the house that whoever had entered had known enough of the house and enough of its owner's habits to move through it with some purpose, rather than ransacking it indiscriminately in search of whatever could be found. News of the discovery spread through Grove Road and the surrounding streets within hours. Mary Emslie had been for years a familiar figure to her tenants and to the tradesmen who occasionally worked for her, and the manner of her death, discovered only after her household had gone silent for the better part of 4 days, was received with a degree of alarm among a population accustomed to regarding her as a fixture of the district. However forbidding a fixture she may have been, the police who attended the scene were confronted with a case that offered little in the way of an obvious suspect. Mary Emslie had lived alone, had kept few confidants, and had, by her own choice, admitted very few people into her house or her confidence. The task facing the officers assigned to the case was, from its opening hours, one of reconstructing her final movements and her recent associations from the testimony of neighbours, tenants, and the small number of workmen who had reason to know her habits, since no single witness had observed the crime itself or could speak directly to what had taken place inside the house on the evening of the 13th. The initial examination of the premises was conducted with the limited forensic tools available to a provincial and metropolitan police force of 1860, a force whose detective branch, formed less than 2 decades earlier, was still a comparatively young institution, reliant chiefly on the systematic gathering of testimony rather than on scientific analysis of physical evidence. Officers proceeded methodically through the house, noting the position of the body, the state of the room in which it was found, the boot mark near the door, and the discrepancy between the money left undisturbed and the items known to be missing. Statements were taken from neighbours regarding the last date on which Mary Emslie had been seen, and from tenants regarding her movements on her collection rounds in the days preceding her death. This early phase of the inquiry established the framework within which the subsequent investigation would proceed. A woman last seen alive at her window on the evening of Monday, the 13th of August, a body discovered on the Friday following, and a house that showed signs of a search conducted by someone with some prior knowledge of where money and valuables might be kept. No named coroner appears in the surviving record of this case, and the inquest that followed the discovery of Mary Emslie's body is documented only in outline rather than in the detail that survives for the trial itself. What is established is that a post-mortem examination was conducted upon the body, and that a physician, recorded in one account as Dr. Samuel Lawrence Gill, undertook that examination and determined the cause of death to be the result of severe blows to the head, injuries consistent with a heavy implement wielded with considerable force, any one of which the examining physician judged sufficient to have proved fatal on its own. The examination did not proceed to any exhaustive cataloguing of the injuries for the purposes of the record that survives, and the physician's findings were communicated to the coroner's proceedings, chiefly in terms of cause and severity rather than exhaustive description. The coroner's inquisition, whatever its particular findings, provided the formal basis upon which the matter proceeded thereafter as one of criminal investigation, and it was on the strength of that inquisition that the case would in due course be brought before the Old Bailey. In the weeks following the discovery, the investigation turned to the question of who among Mary Emsley's few known associates might have had both the opportunity and the knowledge to enter her house and to know where her valuables were likely to be kept. Among those questioned in the course of this inquiry was James Mullins, the plasterer who had performed occasional work for her, a man in his 50s, formerly of the Irish Constabulary, whose prior employment had given him some familiarity with the interior of the house and with Mary Emsley's habits. Mullins was known to the officers as investigating the case, and in the last days of August or in the first days of September, he came forward of his own accord to offer information, not as a suspect, but as a man with a tip to give. He informed Sergeant Richard Tanner that he had witnessed another of Mary Emsley's occasional workmen, a cobbler and rent collector named Walter M., concealing a parcel of what Mullins described as her stolen property. Acting on this information, officers proceeded to search the premises associated with Walter M., and there, in the place that Mullins had indicated, they discovered a parcel of property that was subsequently identified as having belonged to Mary Emsley. On the strength of this discovery, suspicion fell at once upon M., who was taken into questioning regarding his movements on the evening of the 13th of August and regarding his knowledge of the parcel found on his premises. It was at this stage of the inquiry that the investigation began, by a route that the officers conducting it had not anticipated, to turn back upon the very man who had brought the accusation forward. Officers considering the matter noted that the parcel had been found precisely where Mullins had said it would be found, with an exactness that some among them judged difficult to reconcile with a man who claimed only to have witnessed its concealment from a distance, rather than having placed it there himself. Walter M.'s position was examined in close detail as the inquiry proceeded, and it was established through the testimony of several persons that he had an account of his movements on the evening in question that placed him elsewhere at the time the crime was believed to have been committed. His wife gave testimony as to his whereabouts that evening. A woman recorded as Mrs. Buckle and a man recorded as Thomas Rumble likewise gave accounts consistent with his own, and toll road records were consulted that appeared to confirm his presence collecting rents in Stratford during the relevant hours, departing on his rounds at approximately 9 in the evening and not returning until roughly 11:30. Taken together, this body of testimony was judged by the investigating officers to establish an alibi sufficient to clear Walter M. of suspicion, and the direction of the inquiry shifted decisively away from him and onto the man who had first brought his name forward. James Mullins was taken into custody in the days that followed, and it was reported that the inspector who arrested him did so in terms that charged him directly with being himself concerned in the death of Mary Emsley, rather than merely with the lesser matter of having given false information regarding Walter M. Once suspicion had settled upon him, officers proceeded to search his lodgings and his person for anything that might connect him to the house on Grove Road and to the property taken from it. This search yielded a series of items that would come to form the substance of the case against him. A quantity of tape found upon his mantelpiece was noted to correspond to the wrapping of the parcel that had been recovered from Walter M.'s premises. A quantity of cobbler's wax was found among his effects, a detail that officers connected to the manner in which the stolen parcel had been bound. A plasterer's hammer was also recovered, a tool consistent with his trade, and in the judgment of those examining the case, consistent with the nature of the injuries that had killed Mary Emsley, though no direct match between the implement and the wounds could be conclusively established. Among the further items recovered was a spoon bearing a resemblance to silverware known to have belonged to Mary Emslie, and, of greater significance to the case that would be built against him, a gold pencil case. This pencil case was traced to Mullins's wife, who was found to have sold it, and it was subsequently identified by persons familiar with Mary Emslie's possessions as the very pencil case that had gone missing from her house at the time of her death. A pair of boots taken from Mullins's lodgings was examined and found to bear what was described as a possible bloodstain, along with what was identified as human hair, a detail that investigators connected to the bloody boot mark noted near the door of the room in which the body had been found. Taken together, these items formed a body of circumstantial evidence that officers judged sufficient to bring the case against James Mullins before the criminal courts, notwithstanding that no single item constituted direct proof that he had been present in the house at the moment Mary Emslie was killed. The investigation also gathered testimony from persons who claimed to have observed a man answering to Mullins's general description in the vicinity of Grove Road on the evening of the crime, and in the early hours of the following morning. A witness recorded only as Raymond gave an account of having seen such a man near the scene at approximately 8 o'clock that evening, wearing a black hat. A sailor, whose name was not recorded, gave testimony that he had observed a man near Stepney Green at approximately 5 o'clock the following morning, wearing a hat that he described as brown rather than black. This discrepancy in the recorded colour of the hat would become, in due course, a point of contention between the prosecution and the defence, one witness placing a black hat at the scene in the evening, and another placing a brown hat some miles distant the following dawn, a disparity that officers preparing the case were required to reconcile as best they could before the matter proceeded to trial. With the items recovered from his lodgings, the testimony of these witnesses, and the circumstances of his own false accusation against Walter M. now assembled, the investigation regarded its case against James Mullins as complete, and he was committed to stand trial at the Old Bailey. The trial of James Mullins opened at the Old Bailey during the October sessions of 1860, before Lord Chief Baron Pollock, in a courtroom that had drawn considerable public interest, given the standing of the victim and the circumstances of her death. The prosecution was conducted by Sergeant Parry, and the defence of the accused was undertaken by Mr. Best. The indictment charged Mullins with the wilful murder of Mary Emslie, and the case opened with an account given by the prosecution of her life as a widow of independent property, her habits of personal rent collection, her residence alone at Grove Road, and the discovery of her body on the 17th of August in the room where she had kept her stock of wallpaper. The prosecution proceeded to lay before the jury the circumstantial evidence that had been gathered in the course of the investigation. Counsel for the Crown drew the jury's attention to the tape recovered from the mantelpiece of Mullins's lodgings and invited comparison with the wrapping of the parcel of stolen property recovered from Walter M.'s premises. The cobbler's wax found among his effects was presented as corroborating evidence of his connection to the manner in which that parcel had been bound. The plasterer's hammer taken from his possession was put before the court as an implement consistent with the injuries described by the examining physician, though counsel for the Crown acknowledged that no conclusive match between weapon and wound could be demonstrated with certainty. The spoon resembling Mary Emslie's silverware, and the gold pencil case sold by Mullins's own wife, and subsequently identified as belonging to the deceased, were presented as the most damaging items of physical evidence connecting the accused to property taken from the house on the night of the murder. The prosecution called Sergeant Tanner to give an account of the circumstances under which Mullins had first come forward with his accusation against Walter M., and of the manner in which that accusation had unravelled under examination, until suspicion turned upon the accuser himself. The witness Raymond was called to repeat his account of having observed a man in a black hat near the scene, at approximately 8 o'clock on the evening of the 13th of August, and the unnamed sailor was called to describe the man he had seen near Stepney Green in the early hours of the following morning, wearing a hat he took to be brown. The prosecution argued that these two sightings, taken together with the physical evidence recovered from the accused's lodgings, established a coherent account of his presence in the vicinity of the crime, both on the night it was committed and in the hours immediately following. Counsel for the defence, in response, pressed hard upon the inconsistencies that ran through the Crown's case. Foremost among these was the discrepancy in the colour of the hat, black according to one witness and brown according to another, a contradiction that Mr. Best argued could not be reconciled if both witnesses were in fact describing the same man on the same night. The defence called members of Mullins's own family to testify to his whereabouts on the evening in question, an alibi that the presiding judge, in his remarks to the jury, characterised as inconclusive rather than persuasive, given the natural interest that a man's own children might have in securing his acquittal. The defence further called a witness, recorded as Mrs. Barnes, who testified that she had observed a person moving rolls of wallpaper in the upper room of the house at approximately 20 minutes to 10 on the Tuesday morning, some hours after the time the prosecution contended that Mary Emsley had already been killed. Two builders, recorded as Stevenson and Rowland, gave testimony touching upon the same activity in the house that Tuesday morning, evidence which the defence argued cast doubt upon the Crown's own account of the timing of the murder. Mr. Best argued further that the bloodstain noted upon the recovered pencil case was as consistent with having been acquired through subsequent handling or cleaning as with having come directly from the killing itself, and that the Crown had failed to establish that no blood had been found upon Mullins's own person or clothing, a fact the defence pressed upon the jury as difficult to reconcile with guilt in a crime of such violence. The case was placed before the jury after both sides had concluded their presentation of evidence, and the jury retired to consider its verdict. The deliberation lasted approximately 3 hours, a period during which the courtroom remained in a state of anticipation, the public gallery having filled with spectators drawn by the unusual character of the case and by the standing of the victim in the district where she had lived and worked. When the jury returned, it delivered a verdict of guilty against James Mullins on the charge of wilful murder. Before pronouncing sentence, Lord Chief Baron Pollock addressed the court in terms that would come to be remembered long after the proceedings themselves had concluded. He stated, in substance, that he did not consider the case against the prisoner to have been fully made out upon the evidence presented in court, and yet declared himself satisfied, upon his own assessment, that Mullins was guilty of the crime with which he stood charged. This statement, delivered from the bench at the moment of sentencing, placed on the official record of the trial an acknowledgement from the presiding judge himself that the case rested on foundations he regarded as something less than conclusive, even as he proceeded to impose the sentence that the law required upon a verdict of guilty in a capital case. The sentence of death was pronounced, and James Mullins was removed from the court to await execution. The judge's remarks did not go unremarked among those who had followed the proceedings. A verdict delivered by a jury after due deliberation was, in the ordinary course of the law, a matter closed, but a presiding judge's own expressed reservation about the sufficiency of the evidence entered into the record. At the very moment sentence was passed was an unusual occurrence, and it left behind a document that would be available to later inquiry into whether the conviction had been safely obtained. In the weeks that followed the trial, as Mullins awaited execution, this aspect of the case, that the man who imposed the sentence had himself questioned whether the evidence supporting it was complete, circulated among those with an interest in the administration of criminal justice, forming the earliest thread of the doubt that would attach itself to the case in the years to come. Mullins remained in custody following his conviction, and no legal avenue existed at that date by which the sentence might be reviewed or the verdict reconsidered on the basis of the judge's own remarks. The law of 1860 provided no mechanism resembling a court of criminal appeal, and a capital sentence, once pronounced upon a verdict of guilty, proceeded toward execution unless the Crown exercised its prerogative of mercy, an intervention that in this case was not forthcoming. The interval between sentencing and execution was employed according to the practices of the period in religious attendance and in such preparations as were customary for a condemned prisoner, though the specific details of Mullins's conduct during this interval are not established in the sources available for this account. James Mullins was executed by hanging outside Newgate Prison on the 19th of November 1860. The execution took place before a substantial public gathering, estimated by those present at between 20 and 25,000 persons, drawn to witness a form of punishment that remained, at this date, a public spectacle conducted in the open street before the prison walls, a practice that would continue for a further 8 years before being discontinued by statute. The crowd that assembled outside Newgate that morning was drawn from across London, and the execution of a man convicted of killing an elderly widow of considerable property attracted an audience shaped by the same curiosity and moral interest that had followed the case since the discovery of the body in August. The officer who carried out the execution is not confirmed by name in the sources consulted for this account, though the office of executioner for the City of London and Middlesex was held throughout this period by a single individual who performed the great majority of hangings carried out at Newgate in these years. In the period surrounding his execution, a statement attributed to James Mullins was released, in which he protested his innocence of the murder of Mary Emsley in forceful terms, describing his conviction as resting upon evidence he characterised as false. This statement, as reported, also contained an assertion that Walter M. had played no part in the crime, a reaffirmation of the innocence of the very man Mullins had earlier sought to implicate. Commentators examining the case in later years have noted that this combination, a denial of his own guilt in the murder itself alongside an insistence upon M's complete innocence, might be read as an implicit acknowledgement that Mullins himself had been responsible for placing the stolen parcel among M's belongings, even as he maintained to the last that he had not been the hand that killed Mary Emsley. The precise wording of this statement survives only through second-hand report rather than through a verified primary document, and it should be regarded accordingly as a reported account of his final words, rather than an authenticated transcript. The execution of James Mullins closed the criminal proceedings arising from the death of Mary Emsley, but it did not close the question of whether the verdict returned against him had rested upon a sound foundation. The judge's own words at sentencing, that the case had not, in his estimation, been fully made out upon the evidence, remained part of the public record of the trial, available to anyone who cared to examine the proceedings in the years that followed. No pardon was ever issued in the case, and no formal act of the Crown ever set aside or qualified the verdict that had been returned against him. The case remained, in the strict legal sense, a matter concluded, a conviction obtained, a sentence carried out. Yet the record left behind by the trial itself, particularly the judge's own expressed reservation, ensured that the case would not simply pass into the ordinary category of settled Victorian homicides, but would instead attract renewed attention from those who returned to examine it long after the crowd outside Newgate had dispersed, and the year 1860 had receded into history. More than 4 decades after the execution, the case of Mary Emsley attracted the attention of Arthur Conan Doyle, who examined it in an essay he titled The Debatable Case of Mrs. Emsley. Conan Doyle, known to the public chiefly as a writer of detective fiction, had a long-standing interest in the actual workings of criminal investigation, and he brought that interest to bear on the Emsley case with the same close attention to inconsistency and unproven assertion that characterised his fictional detective's methods. In his essay, Conan Doyle concluded that although Mullins was, in his own assessment, very likely guilty of the crime, the police of 1860 had never succeeded in establishing the precise details of the offence, with the certainty that a conviction in a capital case ought to require, and that a real risk of a miscarriage of justice had attended the proceedings from the outset. His essay circulated in printed form and gave the case a second life among readers with an interest in the history of criminal justice, well beyond the district in which the murder had originally occurred. The case received further attention in more recent decades through the work of the author Sinclair Mackay, whose book, titled The Mile End Murder, undertook a full-length re-examination of the evidence assembled against Mullins in 1860. Mackay's treatment argued that Mullins had likely been wrongly convicted and proposed an alternative account of the crime involving other individuals connected to Mary Emsley's affairs. Though this alternative theory has been received by reviewers as itself resting on evidence no more conclusive than that which convicted Mullins in the first instance. No formal reinvestigation of the case followed from either Conan Doyle's essay or Mackay's later book, and the legal record of 1860 has never been altered by any subsequent authority. What both works achieved instead was to keep the case in circulation as an example of a Victorian capital conviction whose safety could be questioned on the very grounds set down by the trial judge himself, a case argued and re-argued in print long after every participant in the original proceedings had died. The persistence of the Emsley case within this narrower tradition of legal and literary re-examination distinguishes it from the great majority of Victorian homicides, which passed into obscurity once the newspapers of the day had moved on to other matters. Mary Emsley's case survived instead within the specific company of writers and historians concerned with the reliability of criminal evidence, a smaller and more specialised audience than that commanded by the more sensational crimes of the era, but a persistent one nonetheless. It was this combination, an elderly widow of independent means killed in her own house, a conviction obtained on circumstantial evidence, and a judge who voiced doubt even as he pronounced sentence, that gave the case its distinct and lasting character within the historical record, a case remembered less for the crime itself than for the question of whether the law had answered it correctly. The world in which Mary Emsley conducted her business as a landlady was one shaped by the particular economics of mid-Victorian East London, where property ownership, on even a modest scale, offered one of the few paths by which a widow might secure an independent income without recourse to trade or to the charity of relatives. The terraced houses she owned across Stratford, Bow, Bethnal Green, Mile End and Stepney were part of a much larger pattern of small-scale landlordism that characterised the district, in which houses were commonly owned not by large institutions or wealthy estates, but by individuals of moderate means, often widows or retired tradespeople, who depended upon weekly rents collected in person from tenants who themselves worked in the docks, the workshops, and the small trades that filled the streets around them. This system required its landlords and landladies to move, week after week, from door to door, collecting sums that were frequently small and frequently in arrears, a task that placed them in direct and repeated contact with tenants whose circumstances ranged from the reliably employed to the chronically indebted. It was this routine, so ordinary as to attract no particular comment from those who observed it, that placed Mary Emsley in a position of quiet vulnerability. A woman who walked alone from house to house, carrying the proceeds of her collections, who dealt firmly and sometimes harshly with those who could not pay, and who employed, on an irregular basis, workmen whose need for wages might exceed their scruples, occupied a position common to many landladies of her class and generation, yet one that carried within it the specific risk that would, in the end, prove fatal to her. The historical record of the period offers other instances of landlords and rent collectors who met with violence in the course of their duties, though none achieved the particular notoriety of the Emslie case, whose combination of a judge's public doubt and a later literary re-examination gave it a durability that similar cases of the period did not possess. The investigation of Mary Emslie's death was conducted by a detective branch of the Metropolitan Police that had been in existence for less than 2 decades at the time of the murder, a body still developing the methods and the institutional experience that would, in later decades, come to characterize professional criminal investigation in London. The officers who pursued the case, working from the testimony of neighbours and tenants, rather than from any forensic examination of the kind that later generations would take for granted, were required to build their case through the patient accumulation of statements, the tracing of stolen property, and the cross-examination of alibis, a method that in this instance produced a conviction, but one whose foundations, as the trial judge himself acknowledged, fell short of the certainty the case seemed to demand. The particular value of the Emslie case to later students of Victorian criminal justice lies precisely in this tension between an investigative and prosecutorial process that functioned within the ordinary limits of its era, and a result that even its own presiding judge declined to call fully proven. Mary Emslie's death, and the conviction that followed it, occurred at a moment when the machinery of criminal justice in England possessed no means by which a jury's verdict, once returned, could be formally reviewed or reconsidered on appeal. This absence of any appellate remedy meant that whatever doubts existed, whether in the mind of the trial judge or in the minds of those who studied the case in later years, could never translate into a formal correction of the record. The verdict of guilty and the sentence of death that followed it remained the final legal word on the matter for the whole of the succeeding century and beyond, a permanence that stood in some tension with the trial judge's own recorded hesitation, and that later commentators, working within a legal system that had by their own time developed a court of criminal appeal, would regard as a case that, tried under later procedures, might well have reached a different, or at least a less certain conclusion. The newspapers of London and its surrounding counties gave the case extensive coverage throughout the autumn of 1860, from the first reports of the discovery at Grove Road, through the verdict, and on to the execution outside Newgate. Coverage that reflected the particular fascination such a case held for readers of the period. An elderly widow of property struck down in the privacy of her own house by a man who had once worked for her. Local newspapers serving the districts of Stepney, Bow and Mile End carried accounts of the trial in considerable detail, reproducing testimony at length for readers, many of whom would themselves have known Mary Emslie by sight, as a woman seen collecting her rents along their own streets, or would have known one of her tenants, or one of the workmen who had at various times been employed to repair her properties. For a population accustomed to reading of crime in districts other than their own, the Emslie case carried the particular weight of proximity. A murder committed not in some distant part of the city, but in a house that many readers could have walked past on an ordinary afternoon. Among the tenants who rented from Mary Emslie across her several properties were labourers connected to the docks that lined the river to the south, small tradesmen who kept shops along the main thoroughfares of Bow and Mile End, and families of more modest means who occupied the smaller and less desirable of her houses, those let at the lowest weekly rates and consequently most prone to arrears. It was this population, diverse in trade and circumstance but uniform in its weekly obligation to a landlady who called in person to collect what was owed, that furnished much of the testimony gathered by the police in the days following the discovery of her body, testimony concerning her habits, her last known movements, and the general reputation she held among those who dealt with her regularly. Several among them described her consistently as strict in her dealings, but not dishonest, a woman who enforced the terms of her tenancies without exception, but who was not accused, even by those who resented her firmness, of any dealing that fell outside the ordinary and accepted conduct of a landlady of her generation. The parish of Stepney itself, in the years surrounding 1860, contained within its boundaries a considerable number of small landlords and landladies operating on a scale comparable to that of Mary Emslie, individuals who had acquired, through inheritance or through their own trade, a handful of houses let to weekly tenants, and who conducted the business of collection and maintenance largely without assistance. None of these contemporaries achieved anything resembling the notoriety that attached itself to Mary Emslie's case, a distinction owed not to the scale of her holdings, which appear to have been unremarkable among landladies of her type, but to the specific and violent manner of her death, and to the doubt that would come to surround the conviction obtained for it. It was this combination of an ordinary life conducted according to an ordinary and widely shared occupation, ended by a crime whose resolution in law never entirely settled the question of guilt, that fixed the case of Mary Emslie in the historical record in a manner that the great majority of her contemporaries, landladies and tenants alike, left no comparable trace behind. The room in which Mary Emslie kept her stock of wallpaper occupied a position at the rear of the upper story of the house, a space given over to the practical business of property maintenance rather than to any purpose of ordinary domestic living, stacked with rolls of paper of varying pattern and quality, remnants and surplus accumulated over years of repairing and redecorating the many houses under her ownership. It was, in effect, a working landlady's storeroom, set within her own private residence, evidence of the degree to which the management of her properties had come to occupy the physical space of her own home, as thoroughly as it occupied her daily rounds. That her body was found in this particular room, rather than in any of the more conventionally furnished living spaces of the house, has been read by those who have studied the case as consistent with an assailant who either encountered her there in the ordinary course of her business, moving among her materials, or who forced her into that part of the house in the course of a struggle that began elsewhere. The house itself, standing among its neighbours on Grove Road, gave no outward indication of the wealth its owner possessed. Mary Emslie did not live in the manner that her financial position might have permitted, maintaining no carriage, no domestic staff, and no visible display of the income her properties generated. This absence of ordinary signs of prosperity appears to have been consistent with the frugal and guarded character attributed to her by those who knew her, a woman who preferred to keep the scale of her wealth as private as she kept the interior of her house, admitting tradesmen and workmen only as strictly required by the business of maintaining her properties, and admitting almost no one else at all. It was precisely this combination, considerable wealth held by a woman of visibly modest habits, living without protection or companionship in a house she rarely opened to visitors, that later commentators have identified as the condition that made her death possible, a private fortune managed in near total isolation, in a district where a great many of her neighbours could not have guessed at the extent of what she owned. The legal proceedings that followed her death were followed with particular attention by contemporary observers concerned with the broader question of how circumstantial evidence ought properly to be weighed in a capital case. The Emslie trial coming to be cited in the years and decades that followed as an instance in which a conviction had been secured on a chain of inference, physical items connected to the accused, testimony of sightings subject to contradiction, and no single piece of direct evidence placing the prisoner inside the house at the hour of the killing. This quality of the case, a conviction built entirely upon the cumulative weight of circumstance rather than upon eyewitness testimony to the act itself, gave it a lasting interest to students of the law that extended well beyond the districts of Stepney and Mile End where the crime had actually occurred, situating it within a wider conversation about the limits of what circumstantial proof could properly be asked to establish in matters of life and death. The case of Mary Emslie was the last of these three cases to enter the historical record. The conviction was entered. The execution was carried out in 1860. The case became part of the national record. It has not left.